which I've now done. So welcome everybody. Over to you, John. This session is Secrets Revealed, Attention! And as I said already, it's about the military history of Gloucestershire. Off you go, John.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So welcome to today's talk. As I say, we're looking at sort of all of the Gloucestershire military history as we've got in the archive. So it's by default, it's quite a long talk. So what I've tried to do is try and pick sort of, interesting snippets out of it. And the only way I thought I could really handle it was by actually going through it chronologically. So we start off really early, and then we'll end up at World War II, essentially. So the first one we have, here we go, I'll go straight into it, forget my mouse, there we go, is Henry VIII's wars against Scotland and France. So Henry's reign was marked by a series of on and off wars with Scotland and France. And in July 1544, Henry kicked off what was his third invasion of France by sending quite a large army from the Pale of Calais. We tend to call that the Pas de Calais now, but it was still in English possession at the time. So he sent this army down to lay siege to Boulogne, which he fancied taking, and that was taken in September. But of course, our news was quite slow travelling these days, so we've got this note from the parish register of Buckland, which records the capture of Boulogne. So in this year, the 25th September was Boulogne won. You get little snippets like this through some parish registers, depending on how sort of chatty the vicar was. And Boulogne remained in English possession then for little over till 1550, little over 10 years, when it was returned to France under a Treaty of Boulogne, which coincidentally concluded the war rough wooing in Scotland, which was where we were trying to butter the Scots up, basically. Moving on a bit, we get to the Irish Rebellion, which is 1593 to 1602, took place when Irish clans sided with Spanish allies, and they're basically fighting against English rule, and the response was to the ongoing Tudor colonisation of Ireland, which obviously they weren't happy about. It was actually the largest conflict fought in the Elizabethan era, and at its height there was more than 18,000 English soldiers fighting in Ireland, which is quite a high number. It ended with a decisive victory at the Siege of Kinsale, and subsequently many of the Irish lords left and they never returned to Ireland. So it really marks the end of Gaelic Ireland, and it's still sort of marked and celebrated in places today. We've got a little bit of information on this one. This is a letter from Lord Chandos to the Privy Council informing them that he'd ordered, as I ordered, he'd levied and pressed out of the county 100 men for service in Ireland. What's interesting is he's also given £350 to the Exchequer raised by funds for this war. And the paragraph in the bottom left there, it's a very cautious request from him asking for some money because he outfitted these soldiers with coats and also paid for them to march through to London, Bristol, where they were going to embark. Moving on, we get the famous war with Spain, 1585-1604, the Elizabeth's War, made famous by the Armada, which is the first of 4 failed invasion attempts. So they tried it 4 times, and included a lot of English privateering against Spanish ships and some widely separated battles. We've all heard of the sort of Elizabeth Sea Dogs, Drake, Frobisher Rally, etc. But obviously Elizabeth was quite cash-strapped at the time, and so there was all ongoing attempts to try and raise money. And this is a nice little extract we have calling for contributions for the Armada, defence against the Armada, and this is the one from Gloucestershire. So there's a fair few nobles in there having to cough up. Generally looks like 25 quid was the standard amount, but somebody there has actually put a nice amount of £50 in. So he's obviously trying to curry favour with the Queen as well. Moving on to the English Civil Wars. They call them the Civil Wars, but there is a whole series of wars at the time. And the better name for it really is the Wars of the 3 Kingdoms or 4 Kingdoms. So you had the Bishops' Wars with the early one, the Rebellion in Ireland, a second one, and then you get the 3 English Civil Wars, as it were. Gloucestershire was prominent in the first Civil War, really, 1642 to 46. Siege of Gloucester, 1643, was a watershed moment in the conflict. Ultimately, you can argue, leading to the downfall of Charles. And the first Civil War technically ended with the Battle of Stonewall in 1646. But in addition to this, of course, there are numerous smaller battles, skirmishes in the forest, Vale and Cotswolds, and many of these places were garrisoned. And of course, with these armies and troops marching around, it was really difficult to maintain an honest living almost. You had to farm, you stood a chance of being plundered, looted, impressed, etc. So we've got a fair bit of information on the Civil War. So I've just picked up a few here, which is interesting. First one is the ship money. It's a customary tax paid by coastal counties in times of war, and just purposely to strengthen the navy. But when Charles I extended it to all counties in England, it caused a massive backlash and a lot of opposition to his rule, and it really was the start of him coming into conflict with Parliament. We've got this lovely note here. In 1639, Humphrey Tracy, who was the 3rd Baronet of Stanway and High Sheriff of Gloucestershire, so the King's representative of the county, called a meeting with Gloucester Mayor James Powell to discuss Gloucester's contribution. And this was on Christmas Eve. It must have been quite an interesting meeting, and it was called they were called to Cheltenham, not Gloucester. So it looks like Tracy knew if he'd gone into Gloucester, he wasn't going to be given a nice reception. So tried it a little bit in Cheltenham. But a bit of a scrubby writing, but you know, you can see what it says there. It's an interesting section. We don't really know what the outcome of this was. I suspect Gloucester refused to pay. Coming to the siege of Gloucester, arguably it's the city's finest hour, in my view anyway. It took place between 10th of August and 5th of September, and it was basically part of the Royalist campaign to take control of the Severn Valley from Parliament. This would allow Charles to link up forces in the southwest with forces in Wales and Mid Wales, and also into the Midlands. So it was a pivotal moment of the war. The borough, the city knew something was going to happen. So this is a note from the Minute Book on 6th of March. You know, it's reasonably easy to read, but I'll just pull out the top couple of lines. Whereas the city is threatened with a siege, and therefore it is requisite that provision of victuals be forthwith made for use of inhabitants of soldiers. And it goes on later on to say any fat cattle, corn, or other provision to be kept and employed for the use aforesaid. And they paid for this. So the city paid its way and tried to reclaim this money from Parliament after the war. Contemporary map, we found this a few years ago. It was purchased for us. It shows the sort of, it's a very contemporary map, it shows the city defence at the time of the siege. Most of the fighting took place around the sort of the south and east sides, sporadic actions on the northeast side. Not really anything on the northwest because the city had flooded these areas, so it made it impassable. But you can also see, as interesting is the city were prepared to lose the outer quarter on the northeast sides of the city, which were not brilliantly defended. And they built an inner division, an inner defensive wall alongside the college wall. So again, that would have been quite interesting if they'd have actually sort of gone ahead with that. Luckily, it was not needed. So as I mentioned, with both sides, forces of both sides moving through the county or being billeted, locals suffered plundering from troops of both sides. You know, they would arguably have sort of passes that they could actually take money from you. But if you were rich enough, you could purchase protection, and this is a lovely example by a Samuel Webb, who is quite a wealthy clothier from Nether Lipiot, signed by Prince Maurice, and it's basically giving him protection from looting. It's reasonably easy to read, but it orders that no royalist officer, obviously, or soldier should plunder any house or table or take away any of his goods, horses, sheep, oxen, beasts, or other cattle. There is a big proviso in this, and the fact that he had to prove that his allegiance was with the crown and for his majesty, which is the only reason he got the protection. And I imagine he would have to pay quite handsomely for it, but there's no detail of any money that was paid in this, sadly. We can look at it from the other point of view as well. So if you're actually traveling from place to place, especially if you're a man of fighting age, if you ran into troops of either side, you had to be a bit wary because you're liable just to be impressed into the cause, whichever one it was, whether you agreed with it or not. And this is a nice pass. It's a safe travel order signed by Edward Massey, who was Gloucester's military governor, and it went to all soldiers and officers and soldiers under his command that they would sort of allow John Smythe Nibley, to travel between Bristol and Nibley for 3 weeks from the date, 9th of April 1645. We don't know why he was going to Nibley. It's not given, but presumably, again, he had to say, I'm for Parliament, I can do this if you give me this pass. And of course, you know, both Webb and Smith here would have to be wary that they actually ran into the right soldiers. If they got to the wrong soldiers and tried to show the pass, they're liable to be arrested. The most common references we get to civil wars, to be honest, are the various burials of soldiers in the parish registers, and there's just 3 examples here. The first top one is for Roger Williams, who was slain in a skirmish between soldiers of the King and Parliament. If that's registered from Arlingham in 1643. The next one, Jonas Graveliner, looks of it, was a soldier for the King, and then a subsequent King soldier from Amni Crucis. So again, far to the east of the county. And the bottom one is an interesting one because it shows an example of a camp follower. So this is from Sherdington parish, and it lists Margaret With, who came with the Lancashire soldiers and died at Walter Pierce's, was buried 7th September 1643. So these Lancashire soldiers have probably come down. I think these are probably royalist troops, but it's not said, not confirmed that. But it gives you an example, as well as the actual soldiers coming through, you would each army or each unit would come down, had some sort of camp followers going on with them. So they'd bring some of their families, or just prostitutes, or just women, or just people trying to supply food to them. Moving on in time, Monmouth Rebellion, 1685. James Duke of Monmouth, who's illegitimate son of Charles II, landed at Lyme Regis in 1685, hoping that Protestant Englishmen would rally to his support and overthrow his Roman Catholic uncle, King James II. In the next few weeks of his landing, his army, people did flock to him, but it's primarily from the southwest, but they were not soldiers. They were sort of nonconformists, artisan workers, farm workers. And they did fight a series of battles and skirmishes with local militias, notably the Gloucester militia at the Battle of Keynsham, which prevented him from actually expanding into the Midlands. And by this time, the militias had bought enough time so the Crown forces could start closing in, and Monmouth eventually fell back into Somerset and tried to make a stand there. It ended with the defeat at the Battle of Sedgemoor, 6th July 1685, and the Crown forces were controlled by the 2nd Earl of Faversham and the 1st Duke of Monmouth, who we'll see a bit later. The country was quite happy at this outcome. It's surprising because, we were still a bit iffy about the old Catholics. And this is a little note from the Mickleton Parish Register, which relates to celebrations held after the rebellion ended. It's a bit scrubby to read, but essentially it says, paid to Mary Kempson for beer for the ringers when Monmouth and the rebels were subdued by the King's Majesty's forces in the west. 1 shilling and sixpence, that's a fair bit of beer at the time. And of course, this is the rebellion where you get Lorna Doone and you get Judge Jeffreys and the bloody assizes. And, here's a little prayer that was contained in the Charlton King's Parish Records, a thanksgiving for the suppression of the last rebellion, that there's going to be a few more. This was circulated widely after defeat. One of the supporters of the rebellion was actually Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe. He was very lucky because he was captured and attended the bloody assizes, but he actually only received a heavy fine from Judge Jeffreys rather than transportation or execution. So, if that had happened, we wouldn't have got the story of Robinson Crusoe. We're now going to move into a series of wars. This is the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1713, described as the First World War of modern times. It saw a lot of fighting. It arose out of the disputed succession of the childless Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. From our point of view, there's a few battles overseas, quite a bit of fighting elsewhere, notably at the Battle of Blenheim, where the Duke of Marlborough, who was fought at Monmouth and at Sedgemoor, achieved a very famous victory. This war, the ultimate outcome was erosion of French and Spanish power in favour of British power, which was quite ascendant at the time. This actual war, this should have also been the War of Austrian Succession slightly before it, but we've got a hand list, so that mixed it up and I didn't spot it. There we go. Here's the War of Austrian Succession a little bit earlier, and this document you see in here is actually from 1785, so it's a later war again. And again, it was because we got a mistake in our hand list and I didn't spot it. But again, it shows you, how much action there was around the world. So this is a letter from HMS Weasel, which was across in the Americas, and it was basically fighting with a privateer. Lots of privateers are issued at this time. So basically, a privateer is like a licensed pirate, so you could get permission to fight any other country from your sort of navy or from your crown. So there was loads of privateering going on at this time. The next letter is good. It just tells you how they actually caught the ship, drove it ashore. This war ended in 1748. Basically because the Royal Navy had blockaded France, which was on the verge of starvation, and the British government decided any potential gains weren't worth the effort or the expenditure, so a treaty was signed. Moving on to some of the favourite ones here, Jacobite risings, get me teeth in. So the attempts to return James Edward Stuart, who's known as the Old Pretender to the throne, was known as the 15 and the 45 because it was fought in 1715 and 1745. The first one was a rising in the Highlands of northern England for sort of a couple of years, around 1715 to 19, ended sort of indecisively because the Scottish Jacobite army withdrew following an indecisive battle of Sheriff Moor. If they'd have stayed on the field of that battle, history could have been changed because they'd actually defeated the English, they just didn't know it. However, as the other English Jacobites in the north rose, they were soundly beaten in the Battle of Preston, so it sort of basically collapsed. And again, this struck a real chord with the people who are now of England, who are now Protestant, really. And this is a draft sermon from Alpen, and giving thanks for deliverance from the barbarous, cruel, and bloody traitor, a popish impostor. And it goes on for about 5 or 6 pages, again, really scrabbly writing. But there's a couple of nice notes in later on. It's about the suppression of this late unnatural rebellion, as if there is a natural rebellion, I don't know. And it describes Charles Stuart, who was the young pretender, we'll see in a moment, as a youth taught to govern only with the rods of France, by force of arms, excommunications, inquisitions, fire and a faggot, and all the artilleries of the Church of Rome. There's a great little description. Moving on to the one we all really know about, the Rebellion of 45, attempt by Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, the young pretender, to gain the throne again for his father. Interesting, it took place when the bulk of the English army was abroad fighting in Europe, so we didn't have that many men and they had to be rushed back to fight. They achieved victories, the Jacobites achieved the victories at Prestonpans, Falkirk Mere, and they advanced as far south as Derby, causing quite a bit of panic everywhere. But their expected support failed to materialise and they ended up withdrawing back in Scotland, where they suffered a massive crushing victory at the Battle of Culloden. Charles afterwards, he fled to France, unable to get further support, and he ultimately died alcoholic in Rome. But he's remained as a romantic figure of heroic failure. So all your programs, you get Kidnapped, you get Outlander, things like this. That's all based around this time, and it's a really interesting time and a really interesting set of rebellions, has to be said. We've got some great material on it. This is part of the letter from Major General James Wolfe to a friend William Southerton, written while Wolfe was on campaign against the Jacobites. Wolfe, who was, of course, would later find fame as the victor of the Battle of Quebec and capture of Quebec, was an aide-de-camp to General Hawley at the time. He was commander at the Battle of Falkirk, but he also fought at Culloden in April under Cumberland. And this letter is about 4 pages long, 3 pages long, accurately describes the battle's length and Jacobite casualties. And pick up this one sentence here. The Duke engaged the rebel army and in about an hour drove them from the field of battle, where they left near 1,500 dead. And of course, after this, you have the sort of the scouring of the Highlands, the banning of tartan, this sort of thing. And it's still quite an important event in Scottish history, and it's still celebrated, uncelebrated today. The 7 Years' War, 1756, 1763, again, involved most major European powers, arose from issues left unresolved by the War of Austrian Succession. So all these wars were a sequence of things going wrong and everything. It was a massive conflict between France and Britain primarily, but it took place in India, North America, Europe, the West Indies, the Philippines, and Africa. Britain gained enormous areas of land influence at the expense of the French and the Spanish, basically. I haven't got too much on these, but we've got these couple of nice commissions from the Bowley and their related families. And this is, it doesn't sound a very English name. Gustave was a Guy Dickens, but he was. Firstly, he's a lieutenant in the 6th Skinner Regiment of Dragoons in 1760, and then a year later he transferred as a captain to the 3rd Regiment of Foot Guards. Lots of fighting on many countries in this one. Again, I haven't got too much, but they're quite interesting. The American War of Independence, 1776, 1783, again saw Britain fighting against rebel colonists in North America, but also the French and the Spanish joined in, knowing that they might get some sort of land and territory from the fallout of this. We've got a little bit of information on this, some quite nice accounts. This is from Henry Rooke of St. Bravils, and it's an account of the capture of Fort Washington in 1776, which actually describes the worst Patriot defeat of the war, and really one of the few British victories in the war. Goes on for like 4 or 5 pages, quite a good account. The trouble with the War of Independence, from our point of view, is the French intervention, because they were able to secure local naval superiority along the American coastline, and the Navy was then unable to supply the British land forces with food, arms, men, and ammunition. And ultimately, you know, we just couldn't compete with the Americans at the time, led to our surrender at Yorktown and the loss of North America, which of course poor old George III never really recovered from. Moving on, we got the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, 1793 to 15 went for a long time, these did. We were at war for that whole time, apart from a very uneasy peace in 1802. And for much of the time, England was threatened with a French invasion. And that's, you know, Napoleon was obsessed almost with invading England. This is a nice letter from a Captain Oliver, from the unnamed army regiment, sadly, but it tells of an encounter with a French privateer. He was returning to Portsmouth with his men, his company of men, most of whom were what they call invalids, wounded soldiers. And out of his company of like 100, he had just 18 fit soldiers. But interestingly, the French privateer obviously wasn't sure about tangling with this British ship. It wasn't a Navy ship, it was just a merchantman. And Oliver wrote that if the French had not been the greatest cowards in the world, they must have taken us. And he's gone to explain that Hornblower-like action took place here. Oliver and his men seized initiative, and we astonished their red capes. Several of them were killed by our musketry, which allowed the British crews to board the actual French ship, French privateer, take it over and capture it. So, you know, classic Hornblower-like opinion here. And there's all sorts of these little actions taking place all over the place, as well as the main battles we know about on the continent and abroad. Because of the threat of the invasion, there were lots and lots of broadsheets published. And this, again, is a privately published one from a printer in Tetbury. And basically it called for landed proprietors, the funds of the stockholder, the capital of the merchant and trader, the profits of the farmer and manufacturer, the earnings of the mechanic and artist, and even the wages of the servant and labourer to be voluntarily sent into the fund to fight France. You know, and if you're a labourer and in less than a penny a week, you're going to think, well, I can't afford to do this. I'll have to put my son and sign him up. However, such things obviously were never enough, and in the December 1798 budget, William Pitt the Younger introduced the income tax, and it's been with us more or less ever since. It was sort of cancelled and reintroduced about 3 or 4 times in the early years. Originally, it was just to fund the war with France and Spain. It was set at a rate of 2p in the pound. Incomes over £60, and increased to a maximum of 2 shillings, which is about 10% on incomes over 200. The first year it raised 6 million. It went down after that, but then it started going up, and here we are today. We're still arguing about it, and whether it's a good thing or not. During all these wars, there was something called prize money. This was a financial reward for the capture of ships or cargoes of the enemy in time of war, whether they be arrested in port, on the outbreak of war, captured during the war in home or international waters. And it was a big thing. You know, people, you know, sailors loved their idea of prize money. And this is a list of French, Spanish, and Dutch ships taken or destroyed by the Royal Navy between the 8 years from 1790 to 1801. It represents several £100 million worth in prize money. So it was, you know, an incredible amount of money they made. The largest single award of prize money, this wasn't Gloucestershire, but it's worth talking about, was £652,000. It's about 28 million today, and it was awarded to 4 Navy frigates who captured 2 Spanish frigates that were laden with gold. The prize money is then distributed to the crews, the officers, the captains, the admirals. And this one, in each case, every British seaman on this frigate, so there were about 200, 300 men on board, received at the time £182, about £8,000 today. And midshipmen received almost £800, which is 35,000 today. Warrant officers received almost £2,500, which was worth £109,000 today. If you're a lieutenant, then about 4 of those on board, you got £5,000. 200, that's worth £225,000. And each of those captains of those 4 ships received £40,000, what's the equivalent of £1.8 million each. So, you know, these sailors were set up for life on this. Even the £182 would have allowed a simple sailor to sort of retire from the Navy, buy a couple of pubs or houses. So it's an awful lot of money. It still goes on. It was going on in World War II, though they never got as much. Look at the sort of families behind this. You obviously all these sailors, each one had a mother, a father, a brother and sister. And this is a memo in the parish register for Dursley. It records payments made to the father of Charles Williams, who was killed on board HMS Majestic at the Battle of the Nile, which was another one of my famous victories. The gratuity was all to be paid by Lloyd's Coffee House, which is the forerunners of Lloyd's of London, who the massive insurance and reinsurance market in London. And presumably, we don't know, they funded this as well as a thank you to people who sort of lost their lives during the war. So it's a bit like the Royal British Legion today, where people fund the veterans. This is the sort of thing that was going on beforehand as well. A quick look at Trafalgar. Took place 21st of October 1805, so Trafalgar Day was last weekend. A decisive, crushing victory for the Royal Navy over the French and Spanish fleets. It ended French invasion plans for good, and also ended Napoleon's ambitions for global domination. So you can't underestimate this one action. And such was the nation's feeling of gratitude that numerous funds sprang up to provide for the families of seamen killed in the battle. This is one such example from the parish of Kingscote, where they collected £8.10, about £380 today. But if you can imagine, this was going on all over the place. You know, a lot of money poured into the Admiralty coffers to fund seamen. And despite the death of Lord Nelson, Trafalgar established an air of invincibility upon the Royal Navy, which it retained up to, and you can argue, beyond the Second World War. Certainly, you know, with the Falklands conflict in '82, you know, if we hadn't established this air of invincibility the Navy has, it would have been a lot more difficult to go down to the South Atlantic, miles away from home and supplies, and fight. Waterloo, fought on Sunday, 18th of June 1815, near Waterloo, which was then in the Netherlands. Now it's in Belgium. And basically, the French army under Napoleon was defeated by two Allied armies, one a British-led coalition led by Wellington, and the other a Prussian army under Field Marshal von Blücher. It marked the end of the Napoleonic War. So this period of 20 years worth of fighting now came to an end. And what happens afterwards? Well, you get missing soldiers, and there's quite a poignant letter by John Lloyd Baker writing to the British War Office inquiring about soldiers and sailors missing. The top one here, it's about a soldier called Biscoe. He was in the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Foot Guards, the son of a John Biscoe of Maysmore. They know he enlisted in Gloucester about 2 years ago. He was at Brussels. They know he was wounded at Waterloo. They don't know what happened to him. Was he still alive? This is what they're trying to find out. Are they still alive? If they were alive, fine, they might make it back. If they died, the families were entitled to compensation. And again, you got another one down here about a Royal Marine, William Wood, again from Maysmore. He enlisted in the Marines about 20 years ago, it was said, at Stride in Gloucestershire. So it's interesting they were recruiting in sort of a landlocked town. He actually went into the Plymouth division, but he was discharged by being deaf. But he simply went then re-enlisted at Stride into the Portsmouth division, and he was put on board the HMS Norge. It was in the Downs in 1813, took part in some battles, hadn't been heard of. And it turned out he was alive and well on board the Norge, he just hadn't been into port to send any communications. So he survived, but we just don't know what happened to poor old Biscoe at the top. Old soldiers, you don't get a huge amount of biographical information in parish burial registers. They tend to be very straightforward. John Smith died on this day, etc. But the Vicar of King Stanley saw fit to record this one. John Chapman, who died in 1861, was an army veteran who served in the Peninsular War with the 9th Regiment of Foot, and he made this entry here. The 9th arrived in Spanish Peninsula in 1808 during the war. They were in the retreat from Corona, which left it in dreadful battles. And they were the last British regiment to leave Spanish soil, although they returned a couple of years later with Wellington and then took part in the victorious advance into France. So, he saw a lot of fighting here, it can be done. But again, obviously, he survived and he lived to be able to sort of, fairly happy, 73 years, a good old age back then. The Crimean War, things don't change, do they? This was 1854 to 1856, quite a short war, saw Russia in conflict with the Allied armies of Britain, France and Turkey. Let's hope it doesn't go this far next time. It was a very hard-fought campaign, including numerous battles: Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman, siege of Sevastopol. The Allies did emerge victorious, and they forced the issue. And we do have these wonderful little watercolour sketches by James Escort, who was a serving officer, showing various scenes. I just picked two here. This one with a lovely, there's a camp with a soldier on guard there, and then the bottom one shows a camp near the Dardanelles themselves before the troops had moved up. And we know that the 28th Foot Regiment, later the Gloucestershire Regiment, fought during the campaign. And of course, if you're interested in Gloucestershire Regiment, please do come along to our next Saturday, which not next Saturday, our next Saturday event, which is on the 1st of November, 3rd of November, I think it is. I think it's there. Sorry, close 5th of November.
Oh, yeah, the 5th.
Fire night, yeah. Getting me days wrong there. When we'll have a talk from soldiers of Gloucestershire Museum, and also they'll have some displays. So you've got a chance to ask about Gloucestershire soldiers in Crimea if you're interested. Briefly about the Battle of Inkerman, we do have papers on the Charge Light Brigade, including witness from this, but I had a look at it, and the writing is just so difficult. You can't even make head or tail of it. This isn't much better. But the Inkerman battle took place. 40,000 Russian troops attacked an Allied force of just 15,000 troops. But despite being totally outnumbered, it resulted in an amazing Allied victory, and the Russians then made no further attempt to engage the Allies in the open fields. This is the letter from James Escort, who recounts the battle. This is the most legible page, to be honest. The rest of it disintegrates into awful writing. He does mention it's a sharp battle and was attended with great loss on both sides. It was awful battle for wounded, has to be said. But what was interesting about this is that the battle was fought in fairly thick fog, with the result that the commanders couldn't really see what was going on, so they couldn't pass any orders. So the troops involved, especially on the Allied side, fought mostly on their own initiative, and it became known as the soldiers' battle because of this. Moving on, 1857, we get the Indian Mutiny, or the Indian Rebellion, a major uprising against the rule of the British East India Company, who governed India on behalf of the Crown. And it arose really from, resentments caused by quite invasive British-style social reforms, land taxes, poor treatment of rich landowners and Indian princes, and a general scepticism about, was English rule any good, and was it doing any good? Another major trigger was an introduction of a new musket, the Enfield pattern 1853. This used cartridges that were greased with animal fats, and handling these was offensive to the Hindu and Muslim soldiers used by the British, and they refused to do it. Of course, this got them into trouble, which helped spark this mutiny. This is a diary of the local vicar, Charles Blathwaite. He includes many notes on the mutiny, not very Christian notes, it has to be said, including this comment: our soldiers are burning with indignation and thirsting for revenge on these incarnate fiends. The rebellion was put down, but at great cost to both sides. But it ultimately started the road to Indian self-rule and independence, because the British government realised there had to be a bit more careful in handling colonial nations, and certainly the British East India Company collapsed as a result of it. Zanzibar Rebellion, 1859, the shortest war in history, lasted between 38 and 45 minutes, but it was an official war. It was a cause was because of the succession of a Sultan Khalid, who was actually appointed to the sultanship without permission of the British consul. Doesn't sound like much, but this broke a treaty between Britain and Zanzibar, which made Zanzibar a British protectorate. And basically, so we were looking after their interests, and they went against what the consul would have said. So there happened to be a naval force in the harbour, so they were ordered to actually bombard the Sultan's palace. There were 5 Royal Navy warships, 2 elderly cruisers, and a few gunboats, and so they opened fire on the palace. In 45 minutes the fighting was over. They basically destroyed the palace. There's a picture of it in the top right there. The Zanzibar had 1 warship, which was an ex-Navy warship called the HHS Glasgow. Unwisely, this fired on the Royal Navy ships, and it was sunk in about 4 minutes. And so you see the picture there, top picture of HHS Glasgow, and the bottom picture, you can just make out 2 masts protruding above the water. So it's sunk in the harbour very quickly. We have this quite a nice invitation. It's traced. It's an invitation for supper to the officers of HMS Euralius. Sadly, we don't have a date for this. We think it was after the rebellion, but it because the Euralius wasn't there with the rebellion, but it could have been before. But again, quite who they got to explain what the invitation was, I don't know. The Zulu Wars, 1879, fought against the Zulu kingdom basically after a British attempt to create a union of African kingdoms, tribal areas and Boer republics in South Africa. Could be argued that it was caused by one man, Henry Freer, who sort of went beyond his sort of remit and tried to force Zulus into this union, which they didn't want. Saw several bloody battles, notably the massive Zulu victory at the Battle of Isandlwana, where the British lost 1,300 troops and there were more officers killed at Isandlwana than in the Battle of Waterloo. But it was then followed up by the British defence of Rorke's Drift. 140 British troops held off an impi of 4,000 Zulus. Obviously, with all the sort of the advanced technology we had, like Gatling guns, cannon, we did win the war, but it caused a massive shock throughout sort of Britain. And Rorke's Drift especially saw more VCs awarded than anywhere else before or after. This is part of a letter sent by a brevet Major Alan Gardner to the 4th Baron of Sherborne. It recounts his escape from Isandlwana and also from the Battle of Holoban, another British defeat 2 months later. So, you know, the Zulus had a fair whack at this and they were fought really well. And we were just unprepared for it. You know, it's the idea of, well, our guns and the low number of troops going to outbeat these Africans any day, sort of thing. Interesting, this letter is a little bit about how he escaped down the mountain of Holborn with Zulus in pursuit. His horse was shot out from under him, but he managed to get hold of a pack horse and got on that and was able to get away. And he notes that if he hadn't have done, he should have been killed as a certainty. We have our own local hero here, Henry Hook, VC. Born at Churcham, Alfred Henry Hook was amongst those who was awarded the Victoria Cross, the defence of Rorke's Drift Mission Station. I'm sure you've heard of him. Buried at Churcham as well, and you see his baptism and his burial there. Though he was portrayed in the film Zulu as an insubordinate malingerer, drunkard, only comes good during the battle, he was actually a very good soldier. You know, he'd been awarded the good pay conduct shortly before the battle and went on to serve in a number of roles. And he didn't retire till quite later. And he actually became a keeper of the umbrellas at I think it was the Chelsea Hospital for a while. So he was a very good soldier. And again, that's his picture of his grave in Churcham churchyard. If you have not been to see it, I recommend you do it. It's very moving. First Boer War, 1881, prompted by Boer discontent because we tried to annex Transvaal. A lot of these wars are where we've done something wrong, haven't we? You know, we've stepped on too many toes. So the Boers rose up and defeated an imperial force under General Colley at Laing's Neck, Majuba Hill in February 1881. We have a series of accounts from lots of these colonial wars from Percival Marling, who started off as lieutenant and ended up as a major or lieutenant colonel and sheriff of Gloucestershire. His writing sadly deteriorates as he gets older, so there this is fairly readable. By the end of it, after some of the other wars, it's not. And this is just recounts some manoeuvre that took place before the Laing's Neck battle. He's most impressed in this. You can see sort of 3/4 of the way, halfway down the page, by using the heliograph, which is the mirror catching the sunlight for communications. And he writes, you can send messages from a distance of about 30 miles with marvelous certainty. So this really made an impression on him. The British government, the war ended because the British government were not willing to get bogged down in a distant war, which they couldn't see they could win easily without a massive expenditure and lots of troops. So they basically said, okay, we'll sign a peace treaty and you Boers, you can govern yourself in Transvaal quite happily. Moving on, we get to the Anglo-Egyptian War. This is not the Sudan, this is the one slightly before it. This was fought basically to end a nationalist uprising against a pro-British Khedive, and also because we've got fingers in pies, it's done to protect British control of the Suez Canal and our shipping route to empire, which even then was the jewel in the crown of the empire, as it were. It saw the defeat of Egyptian and Sudanese forces, and British troops technically then occupied Egypt till 1936 or 1945, but they did sign various treaties in this, which gave Egyptians a bit more control. This is another letter from Percival Marling here, describing a battle of Kassassin Lock, which is a prelude to the bigger battle of Tel el-Kabir. And again, he fought in both engagements. And again, it's very scabby writing. It's great detail if you want to read these letters. They have to be wary. He does use terms of the day to describe who he was fighting against. The Sudan War, the Mahdist War, was fought between the Mahdist Sudanese of Mohammed Ahmed bin Abd Allah, who is a self-proclaimed Mahdi of Islam, the guided one, and the Khedivate of Egypt and Britain. It's most famous for the fall of Khartoum and the death of General Gordon. But after this, the Mahdi established an Islamic state in Sudan and imposing a reign of terror for 13 years. After the fall of Sudan, Britain basically pulled out. It wasn't interested, stayed in Egypt, and didn't have any inkling or desire to head south and defeat him. And again, we have another letter here from Lieutenant Percival Marlin. He'd actually been awarded the Victoria Cross for heroism in an earlier battle. He didn't know this at the time he was writing, so he doesn't mention it, but he had been awarded it. And he was with what they called the Nile Expedition, which was an abortive attempt to try and relieve Gordon at Khartoum. It failed. They got to Khartoum the day after it fell and just came back. But it did have a very good victory at the Battle of Abu Klea. And again, you know, there are lots of medals from these regiments kicking around in this one. The Sudan continued under Mahdi rule until 1898, when, as part of the scramble for Africa, where all the colonial powers are trying to sort of get people and take over parts of it, Britain decided to reassert the claim on Sudan, Egypt's claim on Sudan, and sent forces against the Khalifa, who was the successor to the Mahdi, and ultimately defeated the Mahdi state at the battles of Omdurman and the Kawayak. Omdurman is famous for having Winston Churchill, and it's probably the last, I think it's the last cavalry charge of British forces. We come up to the Second Boer War. This was fought in the British again, and the Dutch descended Boers of Orange Free State and Transvaal. It included the famous sieges of Kimberley, Ladysmith and Mafeking, as well as numerous Boer successes, causing high British casualties. They really outsmarted us in this. They were very good shots. They had lots of guerrilla tactics, which we hadn't really figured out how to fight. We did eventually win the war, but at great cost. Back to Percival Marling, who's now a major. He commanded the 18th Hussars, and he took part in one of the sort of the ways that we won the war by adapting a scorched earth policy. So essentially, we realized that with the Boers doing these guerrilla tactics, we couldn't take them on in a pitched battle. The Boers were too smart. They wouldn't do that. But what we could do is go around after their countries and try and capture all the animals, all the wagons, as well as Boers where we could. And with them, with the prisoners, they were put in refugee camps, which are actually concentration camps. And it was a way that the British managed to able to beat them in the end. In the Boer War, we had the Gloucestershire Regiment and the Gloucestershire Hussars served in both. So again, you're interested in that, you know, come along to our Saturday event and you'll be able to chat to the soldiers of Gloucestershire Museum about that. One of the incidents in the Boer War, I'm sure you'll remember it, hear about it, was Winston Churchill, who was then a war correspondent for the Morning Post. He persuaded a friend of his, Captain Haldane, to let him go on the armoured train on a reconnaissance. It's made famous by the scene in Young Winston, the film, which is great. The train sort of got where it's supposed to go, started to come back, but then it was ambushed by the Boers, who'd put sort of basically rocks on the line, derailed rear wagons. Churchill actually assisted clearing the line, but he and 74 soldiers were captured. But by this time, the British were essentially losing the war, and the public was mesmerised by this. And we've got this little note from the Churchdown schoolmaster, William Swift, who recorded the incident in his diary, noting that the engine got back to escort with about 20 men. The fate of the rest, including Mr. Churchill, is unknown. And of course, this is, you know, Churchill loved publicity, especially after this, because it what brought him really to the public attention. And they say there's that fantastic scene in the film, Young Winston, where he's standing up after escaping. Oh, Winston, bloody Churchill, you know. So it set the scene for a love-hate relationship with the British public and the press for the rest of his life. First World War, in terms of local records, it's the first conflict that provides a wealth of material. So we've got information on the home front, from propaganda to air raid records, food production, rationing records, as well as memorial lists and faculties, that sort of thing. Letters and diaries of serving troops are also far more numerous in earlier conflicts, while photography was very popular now. So we've got a lot of photographs of various army, soldiers, sailors, in regiments, etc. And this is just one example example. It's from a lovely photograph album from the parish of Amni Crucis, and it's basically, they photographed all the men who served in the armed forces of that parish. It's a wonderful album, really evocative. You know, some success stories, they survived, others, well, they didn't. But it's the sort of thing we have, and you know, if you're interested in the war, we've got a lot of this material. Also, the war featured very heavily again in the press, and this is from the Cheltenham Chronicle and the Gloucester Graphic, which is the weekly journal. And again, it shows sort of the excitement about signing up for the war, you know, and you do wonder, looking at these pictures of these young men, how many actually survived, how many came back, you know. Leading on with that, you get morale, okay? Soldiers fighting abroad, newspapers weren't available unless they'd been sent by home when they were always old, and they were interested to find out what's happening in the war as much as anybody else. So because of this, some units began to sort of write their own newspapers. They were known collectively as trench newspapers. The most famous one is the Wipers Times, but the very first one was the 5th Gloucester Gazette. And a lot of the writing in this was done by F.W. Harvey until he was captured in 1916. So again, you know, you have these things, and we have some examples of these. This actually has been reprinted several times. You can buy it off Amazon as well. And it's got a nice A to Z going on through there. I do like C. C stands for Chelmsford, the town of our training, where it's almost continually raining. So it's good little ditties. These were just designed to keep morale up. And we've got some from the RAF as well, at Renkham, the Renkham Gazette. That's quite entertaining as well, with songs and, you know, who dropped the goggles out of the airplane while flying over the airfield, that sort of thing. So more of those you can look at. Got some nice recruiting posters. Again, you know, look at those Highlanders, smiles on their faces. You know, they're not going to be smiling for long. Interestingly, for the Hussars one here, you must be good riders and good shots. Well, they don't care. They're going to take anybody at this time. Very quickly, obviously, the casualties in Europe began to mount seriously. The Chronicle and Graphic began publishing images of local servicemen who died. Started off as a weekly publication. The Roll of Honour started off as 1 page. Very quickly, it became 2 pages, 3 pages. And, you know, again, there are some really, really awful stories here. And you can see men of all ages. So if you look at the top row there, poor little Private Patrick says he's 19. Killed. Nah, he's never 19, is he? He's about 15 or 16. But then you got the older gentleman to the right of him, Corporal Swaffield. You know, again, such a waste of life in this war. When soldiers were killed, they would get temporary graves. This is the temporary grave of Lance Corporal Howard Rainey, who is a great uncle of mine, killed in September 1916. So, you know, that's the sort of temporary grave. He was then put into one of the bigger graves on the Somme battlefield, or Wipers, I think it's the Somme. Soldiers could write home, and they frequently did, especially when they rotated out of the front line, which happened every fortnight or so. Such letters had to go through the army censor, but they were not really interfered with otherwise. And again, this is a relative's letter. This is Private Alfred Putney writing with his sister Dolly, who's my gran, when he was served in the 1st to the 5th. And it's a lovely little letter saying, thanks for tobacco, you know, I'm still on leave off the front. Sadly, he was killed a month after this letter, and he was actually killed before it got home. So it's very sad, and my gran never recovered from that. They could also write postcards home. These were usually done if you're actually at the front, and they were pro forma things. You could write a few words on the back, and then there's this little tick box here. You know, I am quite well. I've been admitted into hospital, sick, wounded. You know, I've been sent back from base. You know, and the army censors did interfere with these. They were quite heavily censored at the time. We've got a nice selection of these again if you're interested in them. Conscription in World War I introduced in March 1916, but this also gave a chance for individuals to refuse military service. You could be exempted from combat, but you usually had to perform a non-combatant role in the army or an alternative civilian service. And there were several reasons why people could apply for exemption. Moral grounds, which are the famous conscientious objectors, which weren't that high, to be honest. You've got medical grounds, family grounds, economic grounds. The applications were put in to get this big register. We've got some surviving, which is interesting because they were all ordered to be destroyed after the war, except for Middlesex and Peebles. But we've got some from Thornbury and from Gloucester where they happened to be in collections that they were just lost, basically. These tribunals that made decisions comprised 4 men of good standing, usually councillors or vicars, and a military representative. And you always get the idea that while the other 3 men were saying, no, that's a good idea, this man doesn't have to go, the military guy would be sipping a cup of coffee saying, yeah, he's going, sort of thing. So again, if you're interested in these, on the event on Saturday the 5th, we have David Drinkwater is doing a big display of these. He's on hand to answer lots of questions about them, and he's the local expert on these. He's done a lot of work into them, and it's a thoroughly interesting thing to come and look at. It's a couple of examples of Thornbury ones. These are the parts of the film forms you'd have to fill in, and your employer could do it, or you could do it yourself. And the chap on the right here, Jesse Charles Brown, his employer has done it. He's a worker at the quarry, Titherington Quarry, an engine driver down near Bristol, and he's needed to work the quarries, and he gets a full exemption. The same here with this chap. He's actually a colonial clerk, believe it or not, works at Fry. He said, I'll go, but I don't want to fight. And so he's got an exemption for military activity. So he'd become a stretcher bearer or something like that, or an RE engineer behind the front. Quick look at rationing. When the Germans commenced full-scale unrestricted submarine warfare in January 1917, Allied shipping losses escalated dramatically. We didn't have an clue about how bad it could get. And by March, so 2 months later, a quarter of all ships heading for Britain were sunk by U-boats. Consequently, food and other supplies quickly began to run short. The government realised at one point the company had just 6 weeks' supply of wheat left. And shop prices began to soar, which caused a lot of resentment. If you're rich, you could afford it. If you're poor, you couldn't. Queues for food becoming commonplace, shops running out, and the government realised they had to do something. So took them another year, but they introduced rationing. The health of the nation improved dramatically after this because you couldn't afford sort of sweet, bad stuff for you. And again, we've got a bit of information on this in the archives. We've all heard of the voluntary aid hospitals. As the war progressed and the casualties mounted, there is a need for more hospitals. So the Red Cross, not the government, the Red Cross set up a large number of voluntary aid hospitals, VA hospitals they were known as, across the UK. 65 were in Gloucestershire. They were often based in large country houses loaned to the Red Cross by the owners, but others were in public buildings, churches, community centres. There was one at the grandstand at Cheltenham Racecourse. This is a lovely picture of recovering troops at Hampton Court VA. The hospitals were run by VAD, voluntary aid detachments, nurses, etc. Again, a voluntary organisation founded in 1909, so quite early, to provide field nursing services in UK hospitals and in the abroad. And again, I think this picture of this little magazine from VAD 32 and 80 in Gloucester is so poignant and so sad. You've got like a really young lad there, doesn't he? He looks like he's officer material. He's got a teddy bear there, and it's like he's recovered, cheerio. And of course, if you weren't badly wounded, you'd recover it and get straight back into the fray. Perhaps the only positive aspect of World War I, and it's the idea that it raised the status of women in society, especially in the minds of men. Okay, so with the men are fighting, you had to have people to do the work, fill the roles left behind. And ladies, you took to this fantastically in just 3 examples here. So you've got the canary girl, shell filling factory girl. You've got a police lady. They were taking over the roles of many men, especially to make sure the canary girls didn't take anything flammable into the factories originally. And you've got the Cotswold lady ploughing here. She's the daughter of the rector of Brimsfield Ploughing, but you eventually got the land army coming up into this, which of course carried right on into World War II. Very quick mention of World War II. We've got comparatively less material regarding it, strangely, primarily because most of the war effort was undertaken by central government. Having said that, we've got evacuation records for some places, we've got bomb damage reports, ARP material, and some photographs, not too many, it has to be said. The bottom left here, you can see evacuation scheme, you can see that. The map on the right is the post-war bomb damage map of Cheltenham. There should be one for every place. There isn't, sadly, so we've not got one for Gloucester, but we have for Cheltenham, and it's quite interesting looking at. And again, you've got a picture here of the Home Guard. They had competition to see who the best shots, etc., etc. ARP records, we do have those. There are quite a few of those, so we've got selection from around the county on these. This is just ones from the King's Own Post 6F in Gloucester, recording various raids that were taken part. Again, there's quite a wealth of material if you're interested in the ARP records in the county. And lastly, oddly, you get a few World War II records in planning departments. Even the Ministry of War had to get planning permission for sites like this searchlight battery in Kingsholm. So they had to put it through the system. That was usually weighed through, but there's often a lot of sort of communication between the Ministry of War and the council regarding, are you going to put this right? Are you going to damage this ground? So yeah, lots of the minutiae of war details. And that brings us to the end of the talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a massive romp through Gloucestershire's military history. We could ask you to, if you want any questions, use the Zoom chat facility as always. If we can't answer them, email us and we'll get back to you. Asking again, if you could sort of complete evaluation that you've got with the booking, these do help us plan. And finally, two reminders, next Saturday event, and again, I've got the date wrong there, it should be the 5th of November is our attention event. So it's again a military history focus day. We've got Soldiers of Gloucestershire there, World War I military tribunals, the Royal British Legion, the Family History Society are going to be on hand to help you trace your military ancestors, and we've got a great archive display where you'll be able to see some of these documents. And our next talk, 23rd of November, is going to be a transport special, anything that moves. Warn you now, this is actually going to be our last talk on Zoom, so the next talk will be on Microsoft Teams. Now you'll get an invitation in the link to this, and it's fairly, you don't have to sign up for anything. You can click on it and it's very much like Zoom. So I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thanks very much. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you, everybody. Yes, and we have been reassured and assured that moving to Teams isn't going to make life more difficult for people wanting to come to the talks. You won't get your Zoom link in advance as you have been used to doing, but you'll be sent a Teams invitation a little bit nearer the time of the next talk. So Joan, that was absolutely fantastic, really interesting. As always, I learned lots and lots of things. If you don't want to put a question in the chat, we're getting lots of thanks in the chat, John. But if you've got a question and you just want to put your hand up, take yourself off, put your camera on so that I can see you, or put your hand up if you have a question for John. And was that your hand up there, Angela Bowerman? You don't look like Angela.
It's got my wife's name on it, hasn't it? It was, sorry, no, it wasn't. No, it was a mistake. Okay. I was doing something else. So you said it.
Emma, did you have your hand up?
Only just to say, I thought it was an excellent presentation and very interesting. And at this point, I have to leave. But thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Nicholas.
Thank you, Nicholas. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So,
bye.
Emma, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Yes. John, can you tell me, my great-grandfather was in I think it's the 5th Gloucesters, but I just wondered how I could find out more about him and if there are any photographs of his regiment. Is it a basic first ask, really?
So what I'd say is if you're free on the 5th, come in.
I'm not local.
You're not local. Ah, right, okay. In that case, either email the Soldiers of Gloucestershire Museum, because they do a research service. It does take them a while to reply because there's a lot of them. But you can also check with the family history. You can email them quite happily, and they'll see if they can look up some basic information. Presumably he survived. Okay, did he? Or
yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So the knack is really, ideally, you want to try and find an army number or know what regiment he was in. If you can do that, it's a lot easier, because then you can look at lots of the various regiments have their own regimental museums. They usually have information on where somebody served. So I think in your case, you said he was in the 5th Gloss. Probably the best thing is to try the Soldiers of Gloucestershire Museum. Have a look on their website, because their website does have, I think it's got a listing that you can search to see if you can find a soldier there. So that would be a good first start anyway, I think.
Okay.
Also, if you have on our Gloucestershire Archives website, there is we've got information on how you can do research into World War One. If you go into Learning for All, it's a city place, and then just put Gloucestershire Remembers WWII, you'll get to a link in our website where there are some printouts or PDF forms that you can read through. It gives you a lot more information about how to do it. And as well as looking at soldiers, you've got there's one on soldiers, there's further soldiers, and there's the home front, and then there's national information as well. So have a look at that as well.
Okay, that's great. I also have a great grand uncle or something in the, I think it's this is World War One. Sorry,
Yeah.
all of this is World War One. Somersetshire Light Infantry, but he's from Gloucester.
Okay.
Where would I find info
Again,
on
the
that?
best one would be to see if, I don't know if there is one, but see if you can find anything on the Somerset Light Infantry on there. They might have a regimental museum. If not, try the National Army Museum online, because they're like a clearinghouse for a lot of this, and they can provide advice about where you can actually go subsequently to find information on.
Not National Army Museum.
National Army Museum, yeah. Just stick that in Google, it'll come up.
Thank you so much. Another super talk. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Emma. Owen, are you still here, Owen? So we can't send you a copy of the presentation, but it will be going on our website. So if you give us a few days, we will go to the Gloucestershire Archives website, and you'll be able to follow a link to the presentation, and you'll be able to see it again. And another question from P. Gale. Do your archives cover Old Gloucestershire, or is it also parted out to Bristol? Ah, yes, I see what you mean there.
Yeah, so no, we do have what is now South Gloucestershire Archives as well. We have their records, and most of it is actually still with us, to be honest. It hasn't gone down to Bristol, but there are some niceties involved. For example, we used to have the Marshfield Parish Register as well. The only reason we got them, because they were dioceses of Bristol, is because the vicar at the time didn't like the archivist at Bristol, so we got them. Those sorts of things have been sorted out now. So it is a fine line dividing, but I would say have a look at our stuff. Now, is that Kingswood? I just see you type Kingswood. Is that Kingswood Bristol or Kingswood Under Edge? Because there's a difference again. If it's Kingswood in Bristol, then it's Bristol Archives for most of it, although we do have some. So I would say have a look at our online catalogues, check ours, and then also check Bristol's online catalogue as well. Failing that, email us or write to us, and we'll see what we can find specifically.
Hopefully that answers that for you, P. Gale. Anybody else got any questions? Andy, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I got one. Thanks for the talk, John. So I live in Dursley, and there's a big history of sort of cloth making, etc., in the area, as there is in other towns in Gloucestershire. Yeah. And I know that at various times there were a lot of uprisings by weavers and the like, and the army was called in. Do you have much in regard to that?
Yeah, we've got a bit of information on that sort of thing, like the swing riots as well, uprising of the weavers. So it's easier to try and find that in the published information. So in the sort of the archives, the record office library, which you can look up there. I can't remember, there's a couple of books, I can't think of the name off the top of my head. But again, if you go into our onto online catalogue and put Broadweavers or uprising or rebellion riot of Broadweavers, you'll find links to it that way. So there is some material. It's sort of scattered. So there are accounts. Often actually in the newspapers is another good place to look at, because we've got the Gloucester Journal from 1730 onwards. So that's they recorded lots of sort of later ones anyway. So that's something to look at. And it's the sort of thing where you've got to pull out sort of threads. There's no single place for it, but put it in the online catalogue, have a play around, and again, if you can't find anything, email us, and then we can sort of like put you in the right direction or get some
and as an extension to that question, there were some Gloucestershire volunteer regiments based in the town. Would you have records for those as well?
We have some, yeah. We have a reasonable amount of militia regiments. Again, it's very patchy because some stuff was saved, some wasn't. Again, if you put militia regiments into the thing and have a look. Also, if you go onto our website and just search for the military hand list, you'll get a sort of like a 200-page PDF document with a listing of all the military records we have. There are a few errors in it, I've noticed, as I found going through this one, but it does clump these sorts of things. So you'll see, North Gloucester Militia, and it'll give you all the information we have. So again, it gives you the reference numbers to the documents as well. So that's worth looking at as well, the military hand list.
Brilliant, thank you.
No worries.
Thank you, Andy. Anybody else? No, that looks like it. So thank you, John. That was really brilliant. So we hope we'll see you all again next time. Which was, did you say it was the 23rd?
23rd of November is the next talk. That's right, isn't it? Yeah, 23rd, yeah, and then obviously Saturday the 5th of November for the military event at the archives, at the hub.
And the 23rd is about the history of transport in the county, isn't
Yes, the 23rd is all about history of transport. So again, that will be lots of, I'm trying to get all sorts of odd things. So we've got everything from prams to donkeys to diving bells to airplanes, etc., etc.
All right, thank you everybody. So we'll say goodbye and hope to see you on Saturday the 5th and again on the November the 23rd. Bye.
Okay.
Thank
you. Bye bye.